There's a kind of cold that doesn't start in your bones. It starts somewhere quieter, somewhere behind the sternum in the place where your certainty used to live. The kind of cold that settles in when you've been riding alone too long, when the last friendly face you saw was 3 days back and moving away from you, when the sky above the Arizona high country has gone the color of a dead fire, and the wind is saying something in a language you never thought to learn. I've read accounts of men who froze to death in open country and were found the next morning curled like sleeping children, peaceful-looking almost. The ones who found them always said the same thing: he must have laid down to rest. But the doctors who studied it said something different. They said toward the end, the body's last rebellion is to feel warm. That the dying man peels off his coat because something in his failing mind tells him he's burning. I didn't know that when Nita and Selu pulled me off my horse. I know it now. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story about being saved. Saved is too clean a word for what happened in that canyon in the winter of 1887. What I'm about to tell you is something messier than that. Something about what passes between two people and a stranger when the world narrows down to the size of a fire ring. When language fails and gesture has to carry everything. When you find out that the version of yourself you thought you were is not exactly the person who shows up when it matters. I kept a logbook, always have. Small leather-bound thing I carry in my left breast pocket, over the heart, not for sentiment, just habit, the kind that forms when you spend enough years alone in country where no one would find your bones for months. I wrote in it that night, after Nita and Selu fell asleep, my handwriting barely recognizable for the shaking. I wrote I was wrong about almost everything. That's where this starts. The horse smelled it before I did. That's the thing about animals, they don't have pride getting in the way of their senses. Mesa had been nervous since mid-afternoon, that low-headed, ear-swiveling kind of nervous that I'd learned over 7 years to respect. I'd been ignoring her. I was focused on making the next canyon before dark, on the mental arithmetic of miles and hours that a man does when he's pushing too hard and knows it, and does it anyway. The snow started as something almost polite. A few flakes, wide and lazy, the kind that catch the last light and look almost decorative. I actually remember thinking, and I'm not proud of this, that it looked like something from a painting. Frontier pastoral, pretty. By the time I stopped thinking it was pretty, I couldn't see the trail. The canyon I'd been heading for, Redwall, the traders at Fort Huachuca called it, though I doubted that was its real name, was somewhere in front of me or below me or beside me. I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. The terrain in the Dragoons does that. It folds and doubles back on itself in ways that seem personally vindictive, like the land itself resents being navigated. I'd ridden these hills once before, 3 years prior in summer, and I'd thought I understood them. Mountains will let you think that. They have patience you don't. I made the first mistake around dusk. I dismounted to check Mesa's left foreleg, which I'd thought I'd heard a hitch in, and I let the reins drop. Just for a moment. That's all it ever takes. She didn't bolt. Mesa was too sensible for drama. She simply walked sideways and then forward and then a little further forward, and then in the time it took me to stand up and turn around, she was no longer where I could see her. I called her. I whistled the low high-low that she'd answered to since she was a 2-year-old. The wind took the sound and did something ugly with it. I want to say I handled this with composure. I did not handle this with composure. I walked in the direction I thought she'd gone. Then I walked in another direction. Then I stood still and listened and heard nothing that was a horse and several things that were not a horse, and felt the snow coming harder against the back of my neck, finding the gap between my collar and my hat. And I understood, with a clarity that was somehow both very calm and very terrifying, that I was in genuine trouble. My name is Callum Reach. I was 34 years old that winter. I've been riding the territorial supply routes for 6 years, first for a freight company out of Tucson and then independent, which is a polite way of saying alone. I kept a logbook because my father had kept one before me. He was a surveyor, precise man, believed that everything worth doing was worth recording, and because somewhere in the back of my mind I always had the superstition that if I wrote it down, it couldn't entirely disappear. 6 years of entries. Distances, weather, notable encounters. The occasional private observation that I would have burned before letting anyone read. I had a flint, which I couldn't use because I had nothing dry to catch a spark on. I had half a canteen, which was already beginning to ice at the cap. I had my logbook, my jacket, and a Winchester that was going to be extremely useful against the cold. I had, in terms of shelter, nothing, because my bedroll was on Mesa, who was somewhere in the white and the wind being sensible. I started walking. Downhill because downhill meant canyon, and canyon might mean shelter, and shelter was the only thought my mind was willing to hold onto. I don't know how long I walked. The logbook entry from that night is unhelpful on timing. I wrote some hours, and then crossed that out and wrote long enough, and then crossed that out too and left the line blank. The cold had started doing the thing cold does when it gets serious, when it stops feeling like cold and starts feeling like a kind of pressure, like the air itself is leaning on you. My hands had gone from painful to worrying to simply absent, which I knew was bad. I was thinking about my father's logbook, specifically about an entry he'd made the winter before he died, which I'd found and read so many times I had it memorized. The country doesn't care about you. This isn't cruelty. It's simply the truth of the place. The sooner a man understands this, the sooner he can stop being angry about it and start paying attention. I was thinking about this with the particular useless clarity of a mind that is running out of resources to do anything else, when I stepped onto something that wasn't rock. It was softer, warmer. I looked down. A buffalo robe. Spread on the ground, weighted at the corners with stones, with the dark cone of a small fire ring at one end, the coals banked but not dead. I stopped. My mind, which had been narrowing for the past hour, tried to widen back out and found it difficult. And then there was light. Not from the fire, from above it, from a notch in the canyon wall I hadn't seen, a kind of natural shelf, and in the notch there was the orange glow of a larger fire, and against that glow there were two silhouettes looking down at me. Small, still looking. For a moment nobody moved. Then one of the silhouettes said something in a language that was not English, and the other silhouette responded. And then the first one, the shorter of the two, called down to me in English. 3 words, plainly spoken, without particular warmth but without hostility either, the tone of someone stating a practical fact. "Come inside, Cowboy." A pause. "You're freezing." I want to tell you I responded with dignity, that I assessed the situation, weighed my options, made a considered decision. I climbed. There was a path cut into the canyon wall, narrow and switchbacked, which I would not have found on my own in daylight, let alone in a blizzard. And I climbed it with my useless hands and my unreliable legs, and at some point near the top one of the silhouettes. She was a girl. I could see that now, young, 16 or 17 perhaps, with a narrow face and very direct eyes, reached down and grabbed my forearm and pulled. And I am not a small man, but she pulled like the effort was beside the point. The shelf was deeper than it looked from below. It cut back into the rock maybe 15 feet, and at the back of it there was a fire built properly, with stones arranged to reflect and hold heat, and the smell of something cooking, fat and sage, and something else I didn't recognize, and 2 bedrolls laid out parallel on either side of it. The other girl was older, 19, 20. She was stirring a pot that sat directly in the coals, and she looked up at me and then looked at the younger one and said something short, and the younger one said something back, and there was a brief exchange that had the rhythm of siblings, the older one's voice slightly weary, the younger one slightly defensive, and then the older one pointed at a spot near the fire with the stick she was stirring with. I sat down. Neither of them spoke to me for several minutes. The younger one disappeared and came back with my logbook, which had fallen from my pocket on the climb up, and handed it to me without expression. The older one produced a piece of cloth and wrapped it around my hands without being asked, tucking the ends in with a brisk efficiency that reminded me, absurdly, of my mother bandaging a cut. The warmth was extraordinary. Not comfortable, not yet. It was the kind of warmth that hurts first, when feeling comes back to places that had given up on feeling, and I sat with my jaw locked against the sounds I wanted to make. I didn't make them. That felt important. I don't know why it felt important. Maybe just pride, which is often the last thing to freeze. The younger one sat down across the fire from me and studied me the way I have seen children study puzzles. Openly, without self-consciousness, cataloging. "You came from the north," she said, not a question. "Tucson," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. "Supply run." She nodded. She had a small scar on her chin, curved like a parenthesis. "Alone." "Yes." Something in her face shifted slightly at that, not pity exactly, more like confirmation of something she'd already suspected. "Your horse is in the low canyon," she said. "South end." She found the grass. The relief I felt at that was almost structural, like a weight had been removed from the frame of something. "Thank you," I said. She shrugged one shoulder. The older one said something, and the younger one responded, and then translated, without being asked. "My sister says you should eat first and be grateful later." "Tell her she's right," I said. The younger one looked at me for a moment, and then smiled, briefly, at her own private assessment of something, and said nothing, and I had the distinct impression I had been evaluated in terms I didn't entirely understand. They were Apache. Western, I thought, though I knew even then that my ability to distinguish between bands was approximate at best and presumptuous at worst. I knew enough to know I didn't know enough, which was more than some men could say and considerably less than I needed. The younger one was named Nita. She'd been learning English for 3 years, she told me, from a mixed-blood woman in a village I'd never heard of, and she spoke it with precision that occasionally outpaced my listening. She chose her words carefully, not from uncertainty but from principle. She seemed to believe that inexact language was a kind of disrespect. The older one was Selu. She spoke no English or very little and did not seem troubled by this. She continued to manage the fire and the cooking with a quiet competence that was frankly humbling to observe. The fire tended with exactly the right amounts of wood at exactly the right times, adjusted without apparent calculation, the pot checked and adjusted. She had long, capable hands and a stillness that I associated, in my admittedly limited experience, with people who have done hard things long enough that hard things no longer announce themselves. Nita told me they were moving east, to family. She didn't explain the specifics and I didn't ask, because I'd been on enough supply routes through territorial country to understand that some conversations were not mine to initiate. I ate what Selu put in front of me. I couldn't identify all of it, but it was hot and it had fat in it, and my body received it like an apology. The snow outside the shelf was coming harder. I could hear it. I could hear the wind working its way around the canyon walls and not quite reaching us here. This notch being oriented in a direction that the wind kept missing, which was either deliberate positioning or very good fortune, and I suspected was probably the former. I took out my logbook. Old habit, when things happen, write them down before the mind starts revising. I found a clean page. My handwriting was still shaky, the letters leaning into each other like they were cold too. I wrote 2 sisters, Apache. Found me on the canyon floor, I would not have survived the night. I stopped. I crossed out the last sentence, and then wrote it again. I would not have survived the night. Some things need to be written twice before they become real. Nita watched me writing. She didn't ask about it. Selu glanced over once, registered the logbook, and returned to the fire. After a moment, Nita said, "You write down what happens." "Yes, so you won't forget." I thought about my father, his precise handwriting, the entries that stopped in February of 1874, mid-sentence, mid-surveying trip, and never continued. "So it continues," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I meant by that. Nita considered this. Then she nodded once slowly with the air of someone filing something away. Outside, the wind was saying things I no longer had to listen to. The fire was doing its job. Selu said something, the first words she directed even approximately at me, and Nita translated without drama. She says sleep. The storm will be through by morning. I lay down on the spare bedroll they'd placed, without discussion, near the fire. I didn't sleep immediately. I lay and looked at the rock ceiling of the shelf, which was dark and dense, and older than anything I had a word for, and I listened to the sisters moving around the fire in a companionable, practiced silence, and I thought about the entry my father wrote. "The country doesn't care about you." He was right, the country didn't. People, though. People were a different question. The wind did something complicated in the middle of the night, a long, low sound that pulled me partway out of sleep. I turned onto my side. Across the fire, both sisters were sleeping, the older one on her back with her hands folded, the younger one curled tight, one arm tucked under her head. I took out the logbook. In the dim of the banked fire, I wrote. I was wrong about almost everything. I couldn't have told you precisely what I meant. That's what I wrote. In the morning, everything would be different, and some things would not be different, and there would be a moment between Nita and me that I haven't written down yet, not in the logbook and not anywhere, because I'm not sure language is the right instrument for it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The fire breathed. The snow fell. I slept. Morning in Canyon country does not arrive gently. It arrives without announcement, a sudden gray-blue light that appears at the mouth of the shelf like someone has lifted a curtain, and the cold comes in with it, fresher than the night's cold, with a bite that the fire had temporarily convinced me to forget. I sat up. My body ran a rapid inventory, hands functional, feet sore but present, right shoulder knotted from the angle of sleep. The fire had been kept through the night. I could see that, the coals precise and even, and I did not think I had done it. Selu was already awake. She was outside the shelf, standing at the edge of the rock, looking east, her breath making shapes in the cold air. I watched her for a moment. She had her arms crossed not tightly, not against cold exactly, more like the posture of thinking. The storm had passed the way storms do in high desert country, completely and without apology. The sky was the deep, washed blue that only comes after heavy weather, and the ground below was white and featureless and very bright. She must have heard me shift because she turned. She looked at me directly, she did everything directly. I was beginning to understand this about her, and said a single word in Apache. Then she went back to looking east. Nita, still half asleep, translated from somewhere inside her bedroll. She says the horse is still there. How does she know? A pause, then from the bedroll, she just does. I didn't push it. Some things are better accepted than explained. Nita emerged gradually, the way young people emerge from sleep, in stages, each one reluctant. She sat up, pushed her hair back, looked at me with the frank, uncalibrated assessment that she'd been using since last night and said, "You kept writing." I could see the light. "Habit. What did you write?" "That I owed a debt," I said, which wasn't exactly what I'd written but was close enough to be true. She seemed to consider this. Then, Selu says there's no debt, you were cold, we had a fire. Selu can say what she likes. Something in Nita's face shifted, not quite amusement, more like reluctant respect. She will, she said. She usually does. We ate the remainder of what Selu had made the night before, heated back to life over a rebuilt fire. I learned, in the process of eating and the small, uncomfortable business of being a guest in a borrowed space, several things about the sisters. Selu was 22. She had been managing the journey east for 12 days. She did not say from what, or from whom, and Nita's translation of the few things Selu chose to share was careful, selective in ways that I suspected were editorial, that Nita was making decisions about what to carry across the language gap and what to leave on her own side of it. They had a third person with them originally. A man, not a relative, I gathered, someone from the same community. He had fallen sick on the 4th day. They had left him at a settlement 3 days' travel south with family of his own and continued. Nita said this plainly. Selu, when Nita translated it to me, said something short and turned away, and Nita did not translate that part. I noted this. I didn't note it in the logbook, but I noted it. The route they were taking east was not a white route. I mean this practically. It avoided the main trails, the trading posts, the army outposts. It went through country that required knowing. I'd been on supply routes through the territory for 6 years, and I didn't know some of the canyon systems they were moving through, didn't know them as connected, as navigable, as a deliberate path with logic in it. How many times have you made this trip? I asked Nita. This way, never. Then how? Selu knows, she said it simply, the way you'd say the sun rises in the east. A fact that requires no mechanism to be trusted. I looked at Selu, who was repacking one of the 2 bundles they carried with an efficiency of motion that I'd been watching all morning. Everything had a place. Everything went back to its place. No motion wasted, nothing placed and repositioned. How? I asked, genuinely, not rhetorically. Nita translated. Selu listened without stopping what she was doing. Then she said something, just a few words, and went back to packing. Nita turned to me. She says her mother walked it, her mother's mother walked it. The land remembers even when the stones move. I wrote that in the logbook, verbatim. Because that's the kind of thing that sounds like poetry and is actually simply true. And those are the sentences that suffer most when paraphrased. The question of what I did next was, at that point in the morning, unresolved. The sensible thing, the thing I'd planned before the storm and before the horse and before the canyon floor, was to continue east to the next supply point, pick up the contract goods, loop back to Tucson. 2 more days riding in reasonable weather. Mesa was below, apparently intact, apparently rested. The storm had cleared. The sun was up. The sensible thing was to say thank you to the sisters, climb down, find the horse, and continue. I knew this. I also knew, and this is where the logbook entry gets uncomfortable to read back, that Selu had a wrist she wasn't using right. I'd noticed it at breakfast. She'd reached across herself with her right hand to pick up the cooking stone when the left hand was right there, closer, and I'd watched her hand hover and redirect, and the movement was the kind of movement that has a reason. I hadn't said anything. I had no language to say it in, and also no standing. You don't comment on a stranger's body. But I'd noticed. Later, when the packing was almost done, Selu lifted the larger bundle onto her back, and I saw it. Not dramatically, there wasn't a gasp or a stumble. Just a fraction of a second where her left arm took the weight wrong, braced wrong, and her face didn't change, but her eyes went very briefly somewhere interior, somewhere private, and then came back. I looked at Nita. Nita was looking at her sister. "How long?" I asked. A pause, Nita deciding something. 8 days, she said. "What happened?" "A fall 2 days before." She stopped, started again. "Before we left the third person at the settlement, she didn't say I saw. She didn't want to stay at the settlement. She never stays anywhere she's taking someone to." I sat with that for a moment. Selu had a bad left arm, bad for 8 days, going on 9, and she'd been managing 2 packs, a fire and a blizzard rescue, without altering her pace or her presentation. And the only way I'd found out was by watching her hand redirect. "She needs it looked at," I said. Nita's expression was patient in a particular way, the way of someone who has already had this thought and worked through several versions of the response. "She knows. I have some experience. Supply routes, you learn some." "She knows," Nita said again, gently but complete. I stopped. There are moments when you understand, cleanly, that the help you're offering is about your need to offer it, not the other person's need to receive it. I'd been told this once years ago by a surgeon at a fort outside of Yuma, a woman named Devuru who had a habit of saying uncomfortable true things at comfortable, inappropriate times. The desire to fix, she'd said, is often the desire to be the one who fixed it. I'd found this annoying when she said it. I found it accurate, standing in that canyon shelf in the morning cold, watching Selu hoist a pack with one working arm and no comment. "All right," I said. Nita watched me for a moment. Then something in her face did something small and complicated that I didn't have the vocabulary to read. This is the part I've written and rewritten, and crossed out more times than anything else in the logbook. I told them I was going east, same direction they were heading. That I had a supply run that took me through the same canyon systems for the next day and a half before I branched south. This was true. It was also not entirely why I said it. Selu, when Nita translated, said a long sentence. I waited. Nita said, "She says, you're not going our way for the supply run." I said, "Tell her she's not wrong." Nita translated. Selu looked at me for a moment, the same direct look she'd used since the beginning, the one that didn't seem to negotiate, and then she picked up her bundle and walked to the edge of the shelf and looked down at the path. Nita touched my arm. "She says you can come," she said, "but you carry your own thing." "I always carry my own thing." She says don't slow us down. "Tell her I'll try." Nita's face did the small, complicated thing again. She says try is a word people use when they're not certain. She prefers certainty. "So do I said. Doesn't always cooperate." Nita translated. There was a beat. And then Selu, facing away from me toward the east, said something that was short and had a sound in it that I'd not heard from her before, lighter, higher, and went down the path. Nita was quiet for a moment. Then, she said that was the right answer. I didn't ask what she meant. Some things are better accepted than explained. I picked up my own thing. I followed them down. The canyon opened eastward through country I wouldn't have found with a map. We traveled in a particular formation, Selu at the front, reading the land the way her mother had read it and her mother before her, Nita in the middle, me at the back where I understood without being told. I could be assessed, and where, if I turned out to be a mistake, the mistake could be most easily managed. I kept up. The thing about supply route work is that it selects for a particular kind of physical stubbornness, not strength exactly, but duration. The ability to cover ground at a moderate pace indefinitely. I had that. I was not fast and I was not graceful, especially in post-blizzard terrain, but I kept up. Nita talked. I came to understand this was her natural state, not chattering, but thinking out loud, sending up observations and questions the way some people send up smoke signals, seeing what comes back. She asked me about the logbook, about my father, about whether men in Tucson knew they were in Apache territory or pretended not to. That last one I answered carefully. Both, I said, depending on whether it's convenient. She nodded, adding this to whatever she was building in her mind. She asked me what I wrote down about people. Mostly what they do, I said, not much about what they are. What's the difference? What people are I usually get wrong, I said. What they do I can see. She walked for a while in silence. Then, do you think you're getting us wrong? I thought about Selu's arm, about the word Nita had used, she never stays anywhere she's taking someone to. About the way Selu had made the fire last night with the precision of someone who has never had the luxury of a second try. Probably, I said, just hopefully less wrong than I started. Nita smiled. It was the first full smile I'd seen from her. Not the brief, private ones from the night before, but a real one that took up her whole face and made her look very young and very old simultaneously. She didn't say anything else for a while. She didn't need to. We stopped at midday in a flat-bottomed wash that was sheltered and had wood. Selu built a fire. I watched her openly now, watching how she accommodated the arm, the small adjustments, the moments of internal arithmetic where she recalculated what the left hand couldn't do and distributed it elsewhere. She caught me watching once. She didn't look away. Neither did I. Then she held out the bundle to me, not offering, directing, and pointed to a piece of wood that needed moving. I moved it. Selu nodded, that was all. That was the entire transaction. But something had shifted. I couldn't have named it in English, and I doubted there was a word for it in any language. The moment when being observed becomes being included. When the watching stops being an intrusion. I ate beside them and didn't try to explain anything. The fire worked. The afternoon came. We moved east. The moment that changed everything was not dramatic. That's the part I keep trying to explain and keep failing at because the story wants to be dramatic. The story wants a confrontation, a revelation, a single line that breaks something open. But the moment that changed everything was quiet. It happened in the late afternoon of the second day, in a stretch of canyon country that was so still I could hear the snow settling off the cedar branches in small, discontinuous falls, and it happened like this. Selu stopped walking. Not suddenly, she decelerated the way experienced travelers do, which is gradually, so the body has time to adjust and reassess. She stood at the base of a rock face that angled southeast, her face tilted up, reading something in the stone or the light or both. Her left hand came up, just slightly, just a few inches, and she pressed the flat of her palm against the rock. I stopped beside Nita, who had also stopped. After a moment, Selu spoke. Her voice was different than it had been, lower, more interior, the tone of someone speaking less to a listener than to something she was trying to hold. Nita didn't translate immediately. She was listening differently too, leaned slightly forward, her head tilted. Then she said quietly, she says her mother stopped here, right here, at this exact stone. I didn't say anything. She says the stone is the same, exactly the same. A pause. She says she wasn't sure until right now. She'd been choosing direction by what she remembered her mother's body doing. The way she walked, the choices she made at splits. Selu was very young when she walked this the first time. She didn't have the language yet for the route. She just had the shape of her mother moving through it. Selu's hand stayed on the stone. Her back was to us. I could see her shoulder blades. Did something happen to their mother? I asked, quietly. A long pause, the snow falling from the cedars. Last spring, Nita said. I didn't ask more. I wrote later that night that there is a specific quality to grief that is still inside action, grief that doesn't stop the legs, that keeps the pack on and the route memorized and the fire correct and the stranger from the canyon floor warm and fed, that only surfaces when the hand touches the specific stone that the mother's hand once touched, in the specific canyon that the mother walked, And even then, its surfaces not as collapse, but as confirmation. I wasn't sure until right now. I don't have a word for that kind of grief. I'm not sure English has one. I suspect Apache does, and I suspect Selu was speaking it. We made camp an hour before dark, in a place Selu chose without hesitation. A wide alcove in the canyon wall with a natural windbreak and a seep of water that was still liquid on the south-facing side. I gathered wood. I'd been gathering wood at every stop now without being asked, which was, I'd come to understand, the correct form of helpfulness here, not the declared kind, not the kind that required acknowledgement, just the kind that made the thing go. Selu built the fire. I handed her what she needed, watching her hands, learning the logic of it. At one point she put a piece of wood down in front of me and waited, and I placed it where I thought it should go, and she looked at it and moved it 2 inches to the left and went back to what she was doing. Close, I thought. Getting closer. Nita made something with flour from their pack, flat and cooked directly on a stone. It was better than it sounds, or maybe I was just hungry enough that it didn't matter. We ate in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable, the kind that has been built over 2 days of movement and is now load-bearing. After eating, Selu said something and Nita stood and rummaged in the second pack and brought out a strip of leather and some packed moss, and what I recognized, after a moment, as dried plant and leaf. She brought them to her sister, and Selu, without any particular ceremony or change in expression, pushed up her left sleeve. The wrist was swollen. Not dramatically, not the way injuries look in stories, with impressive colors and visible displacement. Just swollen, a dense puffiness above the joint that meant something was angry in there, had been angry for 9 days, had been carrying a pack and building fires for 9 days without comment. Nita began to pack it carefully, with a practiced efficiency that told me she'd done this before, or at least watched it done, or been told how. Selu sat still and looked at the fire with the expression of someone examining a moderately interesting view. I watched. Halfway through, Nita's hands faltered. Just slightly, the leather strip not quite positioned right, needing a second hand to hold while she wrapped. She tried once, repositioned, tried again. I reached over without asking, and held the leather where it needed holding. Nita looked at me, Selu looked at the fire. Neither of them said anything. I held the leather. Nita finished the wrap. Selu looked down at her wrist, turned it slightly, tested the give. Then she said a single short word. Nita said, "She says it's good. Tell her I didn't do much." "She heard you," Nita said. "She understands more than she speaks." I processed this. "How much more?" I asked. Nita's expression was carefully neutral. "She understood most of last night," she said, "and this morning, and probably more than I translated both ways." I sat with this. "She chose not to. She was deciding," Nita said, "about you." "And now?" Nita glanced at her sister. Selu was looking at the fire again, but something in the set of her face had changed. Not open, exactly, but less closed. The difference between a door that is locked and a door that is simply shut. Now, Nita said carefully, "I think she's decided." The fire burned down. The night came in. I took out the logbook. My handwriting was steady now, steadier than the first night, steadier than most nights on the road. I wrote about the stone and about Selu's hand on it, and about Nita's face when she translated the thing about the mother. I wrote about the wrist and the leather strip and the single word that meant good. I wrote slowly, in the way I write when I'm trying to do justice to something and know I'm probably failing. Nita sat across the fire, watching me. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The logbook, the things you write down," she paused, choosing. "Does it change them, writing them down?" I thought about my father, about the entry mid-sentence, February 1874, about what it meant that it stopped where it stopped, that the sentence was never finished, that some country he'd been in had turned out to be bigger than the page. "I think it keeps them from changing," I said. "Or it keeps a version of them, the version that was true while you were writing." "But you were wrong about some things," she said, "when you wrote them." "Yes." "So you kept the wrong version." "And the less wrong version," I said, "as it came." She considered this for a long time. The fire made its adjustments. Somewhere in the canyon below, an animal moved through brush, something small, going about its own business. Then Nita said, "My mother used to say that remembering wrong is still remembering. that the shape of a thing matters even if the details fall away. She said it quietly, the way you say things you've been carrying for a while and are finally setting down. I don't think she meant to tell me. I think the night and the fire and the 9 days arrived together at once. I didn't respond immediately. I wrote it in the logbook, remembering wrong is still remembering, and Nita watched me write it and didn't say anything, and that felt right. That felt like exactly the right exchange. The harder moment came later. I've been thinking about it since afternoon, since the stone, since the wrist, since Nita's face when she talked about Selu choosing direction by the shape of her mother's body moving through the land. I'd been thinking about the supply route, about the branch south that was coming, that I'd been putting off calculating, because calculation meant decision. They were going to a settlement 2 days further east. That was as much as I knew. There was family there. That was the destination. 9 days of navigation and 1 bad wrist and 1 blizzard and 1 borrowed stranger, all for family 2 days further east. I was already past my legitimate turnoff south. I'd passed it sometime that afternoon, pretending not to notice. The supply contract had a deadline. Not a brutal one, I had room, but it existed. I'd been generous with myself in the calculation because I'd been telling myself I was simply heading in the same direction, that it was efficient, that there was no real cost. The cost was 2 days, round trip back to the route. The cost was real. I sat with the logbook open and didn't write anything for several minutes. Then I thought about Selu's arm. About 2 days more with a 9-day injury, carrying a pack, through terrain that required knowing. About Nita navigating between 2 languages and 1 grief and 1 sister who'd been deciding whether to trust a stranger. I thought about my father's surveying work, about what it means to record a route so that it doesn't disappear. About the kind of document that a person's body can be, carrying knowledge through country that has no other keeper. I thought, if Selu's arm gets worse in the next 2 days, and I went south when I could have stayed, I will have made a choice that I will write in the logbook and read for years. I closed the logbook. Nita, I said. She looked up. How far is the settlement, exactly? 2 days, if the weather holds. And if it doesn't? She looked at me for a moment. 3. I'm going to see you there, I said. I'll lose 2 days on the contract, but there's room in the calendar if I push. Nita was quiet for a moment that was longer than a simple moment. It had weight in it. You don't have to, she said. I know. Selu will say. What Selu says is between Selu and me. Nita's face did the complicated thing and then resolved into something simpler, something younger, something that was maybe just relief without the armor on. She turned and spoke to Selu. The exchange was longer than I expected. Selu listened, responded, and there was a back and forth of several turns that Nita did not translate, and I waited. Then Nita said, She says you understand that she doesn't need. I know she doesn't need it, I said. Tell her that's not why. Another exchange. Selu's eyes came to me, the direct look, the one she'd been using since the beginning, the one that didn't negotiate. She held it for several seconds. Then she said 1 word. Nita smiled, the full one, the young and old one. She says, then come. 3 days later, we reached the settlement. It was small, a cluster of structures in a valley between 2 ridges, with smoke coming from several of them and the sounds of people going about their ordinary business, the sounds of a place that has continuance in it. I stood at the edge and watched the sisters walk into it, and there were people who came out, and there were reunions that I kept a respectful distance from, the kind of reunions that have years in them, that require a closeness of standing and a contact of hands that I had no right to be near. Selu's wrist was seen too, properly, by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. I watched from across the valley without watching. Later, Nita found me where I'd settled Mesa and was making camp. You could come to the fire, she said. I don't want to impose. You already imposed, she said. 3 days ago in the canyon, this is just continuing. I laughed, actually laughed, the first time in days, maybe longer. Mesa's ear swiveled toward me. Tell Selu, I started. She knows, Nita said. I nodded. There's a kind of completeness that isn't conclusion. That's the only way I know how to say it. I stayed 1 night at the settlement, at the fire Nita had mentioned, and people moved around me in their ordinary way, and I ate something I couldn't name that was good, and I wrote in the logbook for a long time by firelight. Not the events, not the timeline, but the things underneath the events, the things that don't organize themselves into sequence. In the morning, Selu came to where I was saddling Mesa. She stood beside the horse and looked at the saddle with professional interest, the way a person looks at another person's craft when they're choosing whether to comment. Then she reached out with her right hand, the good one, the working one, and adjusted a strap that I would have left slightly loose and would not have noticed until it caused a problem later. She didn't say anything. I said thank you. She held her right hand, palm flat, for a moment, a gesture I didn't know the exact meaning of but understood well enough. Then she walked back toward the settlement. I mounted Mesa. I took out the logbook. I wrote, I am leaving owing more than I arrived. Then I thought about what Nita had said. Remembering wrong is still remembering. The shape of a thing matters even if the details fall away. And I thought about what I was going to carry away from this canyon and this blizzard and these 3 days, and whether what I carried would be accurate or only shaped, and whether, in the long run, that distinction mattered as much as I'd always thought. I closed the logbook. I headed south. Behind me, the settlement went about its morning. Somewhere in it, Selu was doing what Selu did, managing the fire, managing the world, holding the root in her body the way her mother had held it before her. The land doesn't care about you, but it keeps what it keeps. And some people walk it knowing that. I wrote a long time before I wrote anything else.